Hello and welcome to the Fundamentals of Lute Playing. My name is Laudon Schuett, and today is a very exciting day. We're going to sort of open the floodgates to playing 4 and more notes on your lute. If you've been following along with the series, you know that we started with a single line or playing single note trebles. Then we ended up working on playing 2 voices at the same time, or 2 notes at the same time, and then 3. And today we're going to open it to 4 or more. I think this is some people may ask, well, why not do 4 and then do more later? Well, really, at this point, it's just easier to open everything up. It's going to fit better with the repertoire. There are lots of pieces that are mostly 3 voices, but then we'll suddenly have a 6-note chord. So I think it's good to tackle all of this today. In terms of right-hand videos, I will do in the future. I've got a crummy 10-course lute. I'll tune it up and get it set up, and I'll show you guys how to handle more bass notes. So if you're a player out there who's using a 7-course, 8-course, 9-course, 10-course, we'll talk about some arpeggiation and some right-hand things that are specific to playing with more bass notes. Today we'll keep it to 6, but it can be applied to 7, 8, 9, 10. And then I'll probably do another right-hand video covering just unusual things that you'll run into, particularly in later repertoire toward the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century. So, playing with 4 notes, there are a couple different ways, there's actually a number of different ways we can play 4 notes at the same time, and you're going to have to make a decision based on the style of piece you're playing, the moment, the character, and all of that. So we're going to go over the most basic form first, which is simply that you're going to pluck each string with an individual finger. So P, I, M, A. So let's say I've got a little F chord like this, and I play it. My thumb is on the 4th course, my index is on the 3rd, my middle is on the 2nd, and my ring is on the 1st. Now, that's not going to be any different if I'm playing thumb under, or if I decide, if I'm playing thumb out. The only difference is the thumb is going to be a little bit more forward like this, or a lot more forward, depending on sort of how far you've progressed. You can do like that, or like this. And the biggest danger here is what we've talked about with some previous chords, like with 3-note chords. It's really easy sometimes to pluck lightly with one of the fingers, and we need to make sure, for example, if I go back to that F chord, we need to make sure we have our F, our C, our octave F, and then our A. I'm going to make sure that each of those notes rings clearly. And if you're having trouble doing that, one of the things you can do, let's say you're having trouble with the 3rd course, we really try to emphasize that. Play it by itself, and then really listen for it in the mix, as it were. And you can do that with each of the fingers going through. Some things arise. So, for example, some unusual chords where maybe you have 3 notes on the lower strings and 1 up high can arise. So for example, here's a little C chord. In this case, we have 3 notes on the lower courses, C, E, G, and then another G up top. In this case, I'm going thumb, index, middle, ring, but there is this unusual split. And that's just something that you need to get used to, especially if you're going to play the notes simultaneously. So if we're not rolling or arpeggiating the chord, it'll be necessary to use all 4 fingers to play 4 notes. Now, there are other ways to do it if we throw in a roll, and we're going to talk about that. Now, if you're playing early rep, for example, Dolce or Hans Neusiedler, some of the German rep, some of the early Italian rep, there is a technique where the thumb, what we tend to call today, at least in English, we call it the Dolce stroke, which is that you take the thumb and you go through all the notes of the chord, like this. Obviously, you can see that can work on chords with more than 4, can work on 4. And it's a sort of exciting strumming pattern. There's really no evidence that people stopped doing that later in the century. And when we get to the 17th century, they start adding all of these interesting rolling techniques, things where they play the outer voices and then roll with their index finger going through all the strings. We're not going to cover that because it's really getting into the Baroque period much more. But I think this idea of a sort of semi-strum roll probably continued in certain styles of music through the 16th and early 17th century. So just because I'm saying we have evidence with Dalza and Neusiedler that they were doing this doesn't mean that that's the only rep you can apply that to. And there are situations in the English repertoire where a big, beautiful thumb you may want to do. You could do a fast one as well. So learning to just use the thumb or energetic is a great technique. And you'll notice that when we get into some strums like that, sometimes the pinky is lifting off the fingerboard, and that's totally fine. You'll see really great players, people like Nigel North, who will often, the pinky will come off, it'll go back down, pinky will come off, it'll go back down. You can work on just keeping it down always, which is fine. It's really sort of what is comfortable for you and what gets the best effect that you're looking for. So let's talk about some other types of rolls. So for example, if I take this A minor chord, which is A, E, A, C. Now this is the opening chord to Flow My Tears. And I had recorded this with my duo Bedlam fairly recently, and there are a couple different ways you could do this, right? I mean, you could play it with each of the individual fingers, so P, I, M, A. And one of the things you have to consider is that when you are plucking a bass string from below, like with a finger, you're going to emphasize naturally the octave and not the fundamental, or the higher string in the chorus. So, for example, you get a lot of this. If I silence that bass, the fundamental, and you get a little less of this. So if I have a downward stroke, I get more emphasis on that low note. And if I have an upward stroke, I get more emphasis on the higher note. And it's not necessarily that one is bad or one is good, but you want to think about the situation. Now for a chord, like this A minor chord, maybe you want to emphasize that upper sound a little bit, which creates an interesting arpeggio, right? We kind of have a low sound, a higher sound, lower, higher. But here that actually ends up being the highest sound in the chord. So it has a sort of quality that you hear with theorbos, which have a reentrant tuning, where the highest string is not the highest string on the instrument, actually in the middle. If you want to avoid that and you'd like it to just have it more go low to high directly, then what you can do is you take the thumb and you pass through 2 courses like that. This is sort of the simplest sound, right? We go low to high. And you could also, I mean, technically you could get thumb, 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 index. I find that less comfortable, but it's certainly a thing you could play around with and explore. And you could technically do all thumb. One thing to be wary of when you're using just the thumb to play a chord is that often the highest note, you sort of don't get enough sound out of it. I always find that very challenging. So making sure we get plenty of that. And one of the tricks is to rest the thumb on the string that the string above that you're not actually playing. So I'm taking the thumb through and then resting it on that second course. And then obviously when you play a chord that goes all the way through the first course, we just need to make sure that we really dig into that high string. So this type of thing where the thumb is playing multiple strings, obviously you have to have some kind of roll. I don't tend to use the term arpeggio because I like to differentiate. So an arpeggio would be in time. So for example, this would be 1 and 2 and 3, and that I would consider an arpeggio, whereas a roll would be sort of all on one, even though we all know that it technically is a little bit off. It's sort of playing with time. So this would be the roll: 1 and 2 and 3 and. There are other terms we end up using if you're looking at French repertoire, particularly when you're talking about like two notes at the same time. You might say something like séparé. But the main idea is that it's unmeasured time. It doesn't actually take up, well, it actually does take time, but we pretend that it doesn't. We say 1 and 2. Even though we know that that top note is more like on the E of the E and if you were to graph it out, you could probably chop it up. But we just think of that as all being on 1. So to review, if you want a chord that's played straight or without any arpeggiation or rolling, it's good to use the 4 individual fingers. It doesn't mean you can't roll with those 4. It's just that's going to be the way to play those notes absolutely simultaneously. And then you can use the thumb. One of the next options is to use the thumb to play multiple bass notes, like that. And obviously that's going to become necessary as we play 5 notes, right? Let's say I take the C major chord, and it's got 5. So it's got open C, G, C, E, G. And so we don't play with the pinky. I know some modern classical guitar players will learn to strengthen the pinky and do that. That's not really a technique that they used. At least I've never seen it anywhere. So we do need to use one of these fingers twice. The most obvious one is to use the thumb. We'll talk about some other possibilities, but here we go. So the thumb just goes through, just like with that A minor chord. What we're going to do then is we're going to go thumb, thumb, like that. And you'll notice actually that first time I played it was a good demonstration of sort of, sometimes the thumb can be a little clumsy, and we have to really, really control it. So I'll see students that do like that sort of thing. And what we need to make sure is that it's nice and clear and even. And this motion, it's almost, I always think of it as like you're gently petting like a pet, like a cat or a dog. And you're just getting this, and you can play with the speed. And of course you can, I'm going to do another video on sort of expressive rolls, being able to like play sort of different patterns. But I think, you know, for today, what we'll do is we'll just think low to high patterns. So eventually we can do something where we have patterns where it's a little more complicated. Or for example, something like that, where we strike the bass and the high note first, and then arpeggiate or roll our way that way. Those will become more useful down the road. For now, focus on thumb, thumb, index, middle, ring. And obviously if you're playing a chord that has a split, for example, this G chord, you actually have to end up going through 3. So you've got a nice G chord, the thumb is going G, D, G, so 3 notes. And then index. And I think what I see is most people who are first starting to do this is they sort of play the thumb, and then there's a pause, and then they get their other fingers going, or they sort of get stuck. So the trick is that transition, and it's just getting that motion down. So even if it's a little bit messy, what I would do is just try to get this, and if you need to take your pinky off while practicing, then that's totally fine, but it's sort of a single motion. And if, you know, when I first learned to do this, it wasn't this gradual thing that I kept doing exercises and it got a little bit better, a little bit better. One day it just clicked, and I was just really, you know, struggling, and I was just doing things like, and just wasn't quite working, or I was doing, everything was kind of out of time. And I remember I was like out on the lawn and I was messing with a rake, and I realized, oh, it's just kind of like a rake. And I went in and I was immediately able to do it. So there is a mental factor to this, which is that you need to get that motion down. And I hate making sports analogies, one, because I'm not a big fan of sports, not to insult anybody who is, but it's just not something I'm really interested in. But it's sort of like in basketball, I had somebody say once that you have to learn how to throw a three-pointer or a free throw before actually getting it in the basket. So you get the motion down first. And it's okay if it's a little messy, but just getting that, I think the hardest thing is just getting to that index finger. And then adding the rest. And that takes time. But just getting that thumb, index, middle, ring down. Now there are some very useful alternate fingers that you can use to play. It's not just the thumb that you can use to play more than one string. There's a stroke called the Albear Stroke, which is, I think we call it the Albear Stroke, because you run into these sort of chords in the repertoire of Albear Stroke. I think one of my first videos on here on the iPhone was like Albear Stroke's Fantasy number 6. I don't remember if that one uses any of these chords, but the idea is that if you have a chord where you have a bass note and you don't want to play the next string, but you need to play the one after that. So there's a gap. So for example, I need to play the 6th course, I need to play the 4th course, the 3rd course, the 2nd, and the 1st. So what you can do is you can go thumb, then the index finger hits the 3rd course with a sort of slip stroke where the index finger goes through the 3rd course and lands on the 4th, and then it plucks the 4th. So I'll review that again. So we hit the 6th course with the thumb, 3rd with index with a slip stroke, which just means we're going through the string and onto the next string and then plucking that one. So, and then we pluck the other fingers. So it goes thumb, index, index, middle, ring. And this is really, really useful. This is going to be a very useful stroke, for example, when we're playing 9 or 10 course lutes, where the thumb is way down here. Because some of you may go, well, why not just leap with the thumb? And that's absolutely a possibility. You could do something like this. Now that creates a little bit of a split, because the thumb does need to get down there. That might be a wonderful thing in the context of the piece you're doing, but maybe you don't want that, and you want something a little more simultaneous. Then the Albear Stroke is really nice. And the Albear Stroke can be used even if it's not necessary. For example, if I go back to that full G chord and I want to hit all 6 strings, I could go thumb, index, 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 like hit all 3. So I'm having the index hit the 3rd course, the 4th course, and the 5th course. This is not something that I tend to do. I don't think it sounds as good as thumb, but it's an option. It's something you can play around with. So let's see. Are there any other? I think those are the basic ways to play more than 4 notes, is to do some form of roll, either with the thumb by itself, or with the thumb playing multiple bass notes followed by the fingers, or you use what we would call the Albear Stroke. So just a little recap. Sort of the 3 main ideas here are that if you're playing 4 notes at the same time, you can play them simultaneously, and you just use P-I-M-A. Like that. You can also roll, just doing that, and that's totally, totally fine. When playing more than 4 notes at the same time, we're going to have some kind of roll. We're going to have some kind of breaking of the notes, so they're not played simultaneously. So with 5, your options are to do thumb, thumb, index, middle, ring. Or I guess with 5 you could even do the Albear Stroke. You go thumb, index, index, middle, ring. That's 5, 3, 4, 2, 1. Those are the course numbers. And obviously, like I said, you can use thumb through the whole thing too. I do think that's probably going to be less common in later repertoire, but you pick your pieces, think about it. Sometimes for energy, I will use the thumb. I think I did a recording of La Roque, and it's got these just 2-note chords, and I hit them like this with just the thumb. Even though I hear a lot of people playing it with thumb and index, which is totally fine. There's nothing in the score that says to use the thumb, but it's a possibility, and I think you can add some real energy to your music. So think about what is the best tool for the situation. It's not a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. And we haven't covered all of the nuancy things here today. Like I said, there's different variations on rolls. There are some really sort of esoteric ways to split things. But I think this covers 95 to 90%, 99% of what you're going to run into in your first few pieces of 4 or more voices. So have fun playing around with this. If you have any questions, if you have any requests, for example, you might say, oh, I ran into this chord and I just don't know how to plug it. Maybe you ran into a chord that has a double split, like it's got 6, 4, 3, and 1. That's kind of a cool chord. How do I play that? Well, you could use P-I-M-A. You could do an Albear stroke, thumb, index, index, and either use the middle or the ring finger to play the top note, whatever's more comfortable. I think I'd probably use the ring for me. Or, you could just play around with all the different possibilities. Since many of you are beginners, I would start with just getting comfortable with playing 4 notes at the same time simultaneously, and then a roll. And then I'd work my way up to that 5 note with the thumb doing 2, and then 6 with the thumb doing 3 notes. And then once you're really comfortable with that, I'd start working on that Albear stroke. If you're somebody who's playing on a 10 course, the Albear stroke might be what I would actually start with when you are playing either playing more than 4 notes, or if you're playing, for example, maybe you're on the 10th course and you've got some weird split, like what I was talking about there. Let's say your thumb is way down here on the 10th course and you need to hit 2 notes here and a high note. That might be a good place to use the Albear stroke. So if you are playing with a lot of bass courses, that Albear stroke will come in handy much sooner. So any questions, please throw them in the comments. If you're enjoying the channel so far, one of the best ways you can support it is by subscribing. I'm also putting a link to my Patreon there for those of you who would like to support in that way. I'm always looking for new video ideas. I've had some people post questions, and I'm making videos way ahead of time, so those videos are coming. I had somebody asking about, playing particular partial bar chords, the E flat chord, and how to move between this and other chords, and I'm going to do some tips and tricks on that. So I am here, I'm listening. I'm probably always about 5 or 6 videos ahead that I record, so they will come. But put your questions in the comments. I'd be happy to answer. Have a wonderful day, happy looting, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.